Hi, I'm Dawn Davies.
And I am Dave Broom.
And we're here to talk to you today about European whiskey and a little bit about Israel as well, because we kind of had to put Israel somewhere and it fit nicely in Europe, and apparently they were in the Eurovision. So
Yes, therefore European.
European.
Just as we are, let's face it.
Which we will talk about the UK and Ireland in a separate talk. No, I think, for me, Europe now even for me in the last 5 years has completely changed. I remember having Macmira from Sweden, Stoning, and that was it.
Yeah.
And today, it seems that there's been an explosion of productivity within Europe, which is super exciting.
Yeah, it's hugely exciting and fascinating to see how different styles are emerging and where those styles are coming from. Sometimes from previous spirits, basically. If a country has been used to making fruit spirits, for example, those techniques, those stills perhaps, are going to be utilised to make whiskey. So different styles begin to emerge. And then new countries essentially emerging from state control or in state banning on private distillation, such as Norway. So the Nordic scene is just quite incredible. I remember having a chat with some Nordic distillers, and I'd done a little bit of homework. I thought, yeah, I'm up to speed. I think there's about 47 distilleries across the Nordic region, including Faroes and Iceland. And Alex from Stanley said, Dave, there's 47 in Denmark. So I think that gives you the idea. There's over 100 distilleries in France making whiskey. Not necessarily exclusively whiskey, but making whiskey. A similar number I would expect, in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, across that Belgium, Netherlands, you name it, it's happening everywhere.
And I think, there's, again, we touched on it in one of the talks we've done before about a style in a country. And do you think there are styles emerging, or again, we're just too kind of young and it's too new?
I think you could say in some of the German ones, and probably some of the Alsace ones as well, coming from a fruit spirit background, the way that they're approaching barley is they're approaching barley like fruit. So what they're trying to do is actually capture the essence of the flavour of the barley, which I find really quite fascinating. Once you get your head around that, and realise that these lighter, more precise kind of whiskies are very much in the style, probably also driven by the stills that they're using. So that is, I think, perhaps some of that historical background seeping through into the whiskey itself. I think with the whiskies from the Netherlands, drawing on Genever, and Genever, let's face it, is essentially a proto-whiskey that just happens to be flavoured up. Genever is closer to whiskey than it is to gin.
Which we proved when we did our blind tasting, and we put a Genever in, and everyone thought it was a heavily sherried whiskey.
Yeah.
Yes, there you go.
And
Sorry, Dave.
No. So you've got rye. So you've got a rediscovery of rye coming through in the Netherlands. You get rediscovery of rye coming in Scandinavia, particularly where rye is part of the palate. And that for me is one of the important things about the whiskey, which is if you're wanting to sell your whiskey, you have to appeal to the local palate. And that local palate is dictated by what foods have been around, what wines have been around. And if people are used to rye bread and what is automatic, you're going to be making rye whiskies as well. So it's not whiskey sitting apart from the rest of food and drink. It's actually an integral part of a culture.
But I think that's what Europe's.
Yeah.
I think that's what Europe's been doing naturally for a long time. Anyway, if we look at the history of wine, wine is produced, certain types of wine. I take Piemonte always as my example, but Piemonte, the Nebbiolo, that grape with its acidity, its strong tannins, but its beautiful fruit works so well with the local food, and I think that's something the heart of European culture has very much been about food and drink, and I think absolutely you can feel it in the styles of whiskies that are coming through onto the market, which I think is very, very interesting. And I think, do we need a drink, Dave?
I think we do. I think in the kind of seamless fashion. It's almost like we've rehearsed this. I find France really fascinating from looking at it from a wine point of view, because you've seen that kind of Alsace, because pretty well established distilleries in Alsace who are kind of in that fruit spirit background. Whereas if you come to Brittany, Celtic nation, a very proud Celtic nation, and very much looking towards Scotland as the template. Not saying they're trying to make Scotch, but looking to Scotland as a template. So there's a fundamental difference in flavour between the two. And then if you go down to Bordeaux, to something like Brennan, where you've got cognac stills, you're automatically going to be getting different flavours coming from that. And the mindset of the distiller is different because that's the culture that they're coming out of.
I mean, that's so interesting. I mean, you look at France, and France is a big country, and with wine, it's hugely diverse, and that's so interesting that actually with the whiskey, we're seeing that diversity coming through, and a lot driven, as you say, by history. And this one,
this is gorgeous.
I love this. So this is Glenamore, and it just you put it on here, and it's pretty.
Yeah,
it's just lifted. It's fresh. It's floral. But then if you think about Brittany and that kind of culture of maybe Calvados, you get those lovely high tone, pretty fruits. And this does almost have like a kind of appley.
There's a wonderful kind of crisp apple character. There's a little bit of salinity as well. The distillery is right on the coast. You couldn't be closer. The waves are washing up against the distillery walls. Established by this wonderful man called Jean Denis, who founded the Celtic Whisky Company, the first person to age whisky in Sauternes casks. A real kind of pioneer. And I think it's just gorgeous.
It's just pretty.
Yeah.
It's just pretty, and I think when I'm looking at France at the moment, we're looking at a couple of distilleries in France to bring over to the UK, and Edu's one of them, and I was super excited by them because they're playing around with buckwheat, and you look at that, and it goes back to when we were talking a little bit before. If you're looking at a country that is just really starting to kind of rejuvenate its industry, whiskey industry, it's open to being a little bit more kind of experimental and within the bounds of what can be called whiskey. Yeah. And do you think that's what's happening in France?
I think that is happening in France. I think undoubtedly that's happening in France. It touches on that whole issue of sustainability. You wanted to use local resources, and the local resources will actually are going to be having an impact in flavour. As well as the climate and the way you're distilling it. I'm not long back from Norway, so looking at distilleries over there, and the way that some of them are now playing around with farmhouse yeast, Kveik farmhouse yeast, which gives this insane fruitiness to the whiskies. So there's an ancient yeast type that they're beginning to use. Nordic barley, there's a whole Nordic barley project. So looking at old varieties, Braga, Salome, etc., which have been grown in Sweden, Norway, but also are being trialled in Scotland, especially on the west coast of Scotland where the conditions are similar, and in Iceland as well. So there's this kind of collective exploration of barley and what barleys can grow in these particular areas and under these particular conditions. And every distiller across Europe is going to be looking at this in their own particular way.
And we talk about innovation, and I think one thing that we've both brought up quite a lot in various talks that we've done is that yes, there are rules, there are legislations within Scotch whisky, for example, Irish whisky, whatever, but there is still so much you can do to innovate within those traditions. And I think looking at these sort of new distilleries, these people that are experimenting on a smaller scale, is really we're now seeing those kind of, I would say, ripple effects into the Scotch industry with people playing around with different barley types. Inchmurren, for example, people are starting to do things, playing a lot around with the Dornup guys, freaking yeast is yeast 101, and that's exciting. I think to kind of see that.
Yeah, I think so. And it's this. I think it's a beautiful thing to observe. I think Scotch has been kind of kicked a bit and wrongly, I believe. Scotch has had this kind of dominant position in whiskey for over 100 years because every other whiskey industry collapsed for whatever reason. Scotch was kind of we're right, fine, we'll take over the world kind of thing. But it wasn't suppressing any other whiskey style. And I think it's taken a while for Scotch distillers to begin to kind of get their head around the fact that there are great whiskies getting made around the world. But there is this now global collegiate atmosphere. People are genuinely exchanging information. That works there. It could work here. It might not work here. But that is one reason I think that there are so many exciting whiskies coming from non-traditional countries. It's because information is being shared and amazing new styles are developing.
And I think France is one of those great examples where, I've tasted maybe 6 different French whiskies in the last 6 months, and each of them have actually had a unique style, but actually I think all of them have had this just underlining fruit character. And I do wonder, as we touched on before, is that to do with the history and traditions that came before around the fruit-based, whether that's grapes or...
it could well be, and also, again, appealing to the local palate,
Yeah. And this, I keep going back to this, actually. I just keep kind of want to sort of keep smelling. And I think with this one, they've also handled the oak so beautifully. This is super fresh. And actually, if we're talking about kind of climate, it's maybe a good sort of segue.
I love a segue.
Into maybe the Nordics, because you've touched on the Nordics, and Dave sent me a picture of him with some huskies the other day, and I was like, is that you with huskies? I was like, I want to be with huskies. I didn't say I wanted to be with Dave, I said I wanted to be with huskies.
Yeah, dog sledding in the Arctic. It was pretty special.
Yeah, thanks.
Terrifying at times, but really pretty special. It was good. Honestly, it was work. The Nordics really are absolutely flying at the moment, and no universal style coming up, but again, that kind of mindset of making do,
and I think, for me, it was always probably Stauning and Macmillan. And Zuidam, actually, if you're kind of including Holland and the Netherlands in that, but those for me were my kind of benchmarks, and they're even in themselves very, very different. But like, I've taken on Thai whiskey, I've taken on the Helsinki guys, and suddenly there's so much more out there.
There's a huge amount coming, and again, there is something about, again, kind of coming back to kind of food culture. Again, there's something very, very clean about, and it sounds a dreadful cliche to talk about that, sort of Scandi,
precision
engineering and clean lines and everything. But I think there is undoubtedly something to be said about that approach that's beginning to come through. But amazing stuff coming out of Bifrost, which is the furthest, the most northerly distillery in the world, right at the very, very top of Norway. And they're trialing Arctic barley, which is just completely insane. But making beautiful whiskies, So I think over time you'll begin to see, if not a unified Nordic style, then I think there will be touch points between the whiskies, certainly from Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Faroes, and Iceland. I think Finland's slightly different. But I think you'll begin to see these touch points going, I can understand why that those flavours are there.
And one thing we touched on when we were talking about the kind of the southern hemisphere whiskies and kind of the warmer climate whiskies was, of course, temperature. Now, here, you've just talked about the Arctic. How does that compare?
It's pretty cool up there, but they get the thing about the Arctic is that it's very cold in the winter, but then they have this really, really intense period of a lot of sunshine, and it doesn't get particularly hot, but there's a dramatic difference in the temperature curve. So the evaporation rates are actually surprisingly similar to Scotland. Which wasn't necessarily what was expected. And
I'm going really left field on this question now, Dave. But do you think there's something about maybe air quality and purity of light that could also? That would affect the barley. I'm assuming the grains very much so. But do you think there's something, especially maybe with air quality and that kind of sort of very much more sort of very pure air, potentially that could be affecting something? Dave's like, what the hell is she? She's gone rogue! Just came into my head and I wanted to ask it.
Yes, maybe. I'm not sure about light within a warehouse, but
I don't know. It just kind of in my head, it kind of made sense. Because if I think about grapes, so it doesn't make sense with grain, higher altitude, more kind of UV, you actually get a very different maturation process.
I think in terms of growing the barley, yes, because you do get that very that shorter growing season, but much more intense growing season, and much, if you try the berries from, up in Lofoten or wherever, you try the foods there, and the herbs and the berries and everything, incredibly intense. The most concentrated raspberries you'll ever try in your life, and the same will happen to the cereals. So that's going to be quite interesting once this barley project begins to develop, looking at these kind of older varieties which are suited to those conditions, the flavours that are coming through there, and the yeasts, also the wild yeasts, which are growing up, which can be captured up there as well, which are producing these amazing tropical fruit flavours. So I think rather than, maybe that's to do with light, but I think that intensity, it will come through on the whiskies, especially, as you're moving up into these northern climes.
And I think, when I've tasted some of the whiskies from these regions, there is a kind of very intense fruit.
Yeah.
There's a lot of kind of richness and power. I mean, you stick your nose into this one from Helsinki, and you're like, you're just like, what's going on? I'm like caraway, sort of rye bread. I mean, this is rye, and we did touch on rye. Is rye kind of the future for the Nordics? Do you think?
It's a future, yes. I'm loath to say it's the future. But yeah, I mean, this is Halloween. This is caraway pumpkins and all manner of crazy things. Yeah, I mean, the revival of rye is amazing. Rye is known to be, the American style, Dave, or the Canadian style.
Making rye great again.
Yes. Making rye great. Yeah, but where did the rye come from? Rye is not a native grain to America. The rye came thanks to German and Dutch settlers. So it was brought from Europe over to America, where it was turned into whiskey. But it had been making Geneva before. So it comes back to Geneva again. And I think the reclamation of rye by distillers, such as Patrick Zidam, and Millstone, or Stork Club in Spreewald, in Germany, where Wild Turkey were getting their rye from Germany, for a long time. So this reclamation of this older style and this grain that's been growing in Northern Europe for millennia, and making whiskey back out of it again, I think it's absolutely brilliant, and it makes perfect sense. It's in Finland because Finnish cuisine is based around rye.
And you taste this, and there's so much concentration, there's so much character, and I just want some sort of pickled herring or something.
God, a pickle with this would be awesome.
And that's it, isn't it? You kind of get a sense. Going back to Dave Broom's new book, Sense of Place. You really get a sense of place here.
Yeah,
I think I don't know where this is. Definitely not Canadian. It's not American. It's its own unique character. And I remember when I first tasted this whiskey, and I was like, what is going on? But that discovery is, I think, something that's going to be more and more interesting as we get more of these Nordic.
Yes, and it's absolutely, and for me, it's amazing to see. I did a tasting of different rye from around, including Britain and Europe, and the different styles of rye that were coming out and how they were different to, rye from Kentucky or rye from Canada. So there's no just one universal character of rye, but this is as rye as you're going to get it. The intensity on here is unbelievable. The finish, it just leaves you with this insane kind of spicy, bitter, orange zest. But that meaty
more
thing.
Woody kind
menthol, camphor. It's more like camphor.
Camphor, that's it. It's camphor. But and I think when people say, "Oh, I don't like rye whiskey," I think that you're right. There's such a broad range of styles. We have a very good friend of ours who keeps telling us that he doesn't like rye whiskey, and I keep proving him wrong.
This is absolutely off the scale, and there is evidence, that rye is back, and rye
should be back.
Rye should be back, and rye should be made in places where rye is always grown.
And it goes back to that sustainability again, and we look at a lot of the distilleries in the Nordics, and they are, actually as countries, they're very sustainable. And it's great to see that sustainability kind of feeding back into the distilleries themselves. And I think you look at McMurray with Gravity Feed and and things like that. So the people are definitely doing the right things. But do you think that there's like here? This is a rum cask finish on this one. Do you think that is there a sort of style of oak that they're using? Is it ex-bourbon, is it ex-sherry? Are they playing around? I mean, Swedam's a lot of sherry, but are people leaning to different?
It's predominantly still kind of ex-bourbon, ex-sherry. So that element of sustainability is we're still getting over
dodgy.
there. but McMurray famously using Swedish oak, and Swedish oak is very different. I've just been speaking to a Spanish cooper. He's begun to use Danish oak. So there's great opportunities out there. And if you look back in the history of Scotch whisky, if you look at the oaks which were being brought in for coopering in Scotland for the whisky industry in the 19th century, the majority was coming from the Baltics. So many of them oak it was known as. So there's a history and a heritage of actually using those oaks, and they will have different flavours. So down the line, I think it's going to be really fascinating to watch.
And I think it's so interesting that actually the changes in the Scotch industry around oak use have very been driven by what had to happen to a degree.
It's a reactive process.
It's a reactive process. And I think the world's changing so rapidly. What are we going to see coming through? I think that's going to be very interesting. People probably going more local because, of course, can't ship anything anywhere. There's nothing around. And what is that going to mean for the whiskey industry? I think it's very, very interesting.
And the other thing is that do you have to be restricted to oak? In Scotland, the law is that you can only use oak casks, but not in Ireland, not in France, chestnut casks are getting used.
Middleton, chestnut, beautiful.
So there's lots of, not necessarily lots of woods, but there are plenty of other options in terms of wood. It doesn't always have to necessarily come from the oak tree. So great opportunities
to kind of see things.
And the difference between French, not just French oak, but the difference between
forests.
different forests, in France, so
insane.
Yeah.
Between parts of forests, it goes down so much to terroir. Actually, with oak, it absolutely 100% does come down to terroir and how that changes within the forest.
And then you look at the research that's been done by Magli Picard from Demptos at the University of Bordeaux, who started off, investigating wood for oak specifically for the wine industry, and has now kind of moved across to cognac and now into whiskey as well, and processing the oak in such minuscule different ways to produce different flavours. This is a completely new world that's opening up, not just in terms of new distilleries opening up, but new techniques and greater understanding in field and yeast and oak and everything. Yeah, it's great.
And I think, oak is such an amazing vehicle of flavour. I have a bit of an obsession with oak, so I watched the talk that you guys did and it was so interesting. Go back and watch the previews of Whisky Show last year, 2021.
Yeah, I think it was.
And there's so much variation. Like you kiln dry the wood, you let the wood just sort of dry out and get affected by all the molds and bacteria naturally. It changes everything. The char levels, the stave. It's such a fascinating. Look at me going down another rabbit hole. Moving swiftly on to stop myself. I'm talking about oak, and actually. We're now going into the Israel side of the European.
Yeah. The Israeli entry for Whisky Eurovision Song Contest
is milk and honey, and actually milk and honey being pretty revolutionary in kind of what they've been doing, and even the experimentation they're doing with different climates, different wood types. I mean, this is an ex-Ida cask, but milk and honey. We've gone from cool to warm
and extremely hot.
And in some cases very dry.
Yes. Yeah, no, the fascinating distillery, lovely guys doing it, and exactly. Israeli whiskey. Why not?
And actually not the only distillery in Israel now, which is super exciting to see what's going to come out of there. But they're doing this sort of Dead Sea aging versus the hills aging. They're really going out and playing.
And it's that thing which is looking at your conditions and sort of saying, what if, what happens to a whiskey if you mature it next to the Dead Sea, and the lowest point on earth? What happens if you mature the same whiskey in a height or by the sea in Tel Aviv? And the differences, not surprisingly perhaps, are amazing. What else can be used? Well, pomegranate wine. Of course you can use pomegranate wine. It might seem contrived if you were trying to do it in Bathgate, but it's not contrived if you're doing it in Israel. So it's using what grows around you. It's what distillers have always done.
And I think it's that, I think that's what we're really seeing at the moment, and something that's going to probably go through all of these 4 talks, is this being able to go out and experiment and try and not even challenge, but push boundaries is probably a better way of kind of putting it. But this one's just, you get that sense of warmth to this. It's big, it's rich. Those of you who have it at home, maybe a wee drop of water, because this is past strength at 66.1.
It's pretty pokey. But I find that they're just wonderfully amenable approachable whiskies, milk and honey. There's a warmth in terms of the fact 66%, but I think there's just a generosity and a warmth in terms of the delivery of the whiskey itself.
I think generosity is actually a really good word.
Thank you,
Dave. It's you, wordsmith extraordinaire. But I think if we kind of looked at this in comparison to maybe the Starwood that we tasted in another episode, it's that warmth, it's that breadth, it's that lovely fruit that can hold this kind of more kind of intense aging.
And with that drop of water, if you are trying this from the pack, I would hate to tell anybody how to drink whiskey. You drink whatever you want, but certainly for me, adding that little bit of water, it changes the texture, so you get less of the burn. It softens it, so you get more of that wonderful kind of silky mouthfeel, and the smoke is actually brought through as well.
Actually,
there's also a minty thing on the finish.
On this one, definitely, and I do think, the if you look at kind of milk and honey and what they're doing, and that sort of, and even sort of in that Mediterranean area, I think we still haven't maybe seen what can be coming out of other countries. No, potentially.
It could be remarkable. There is a distillery, I believe, in Turkey, so that could be interesting. But
I just tasted a Spanish distillery that's been making whiskey for over sort of 20-something years or something. I can't remember the exact.
Oh yeah.
Haram. Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. And I was actually just like, some of their older stuff, I was like, genuinely, this is super interesting. And I think we've still yet to see more areas, especially in Southern Europe, that will probably take advantage. And climate is an advantage maybe to a younger distillery, potentially.
Yeah, you can perhaps release it a little bit earlier than in a cooler climate. Who knows? Who knows? But I think, just looking at 3 glasses there, the diversity of the flavours that are in there, but also, not to belabor the point, but the integrity that lies behind them, I think really comes through, because here you have 3 very different whiskey makers expressing themselves and also expressing where they're from.
Sense of place, Dave.
It's almost like a title of a book,
which
is
out like a title.
On the 29th of September.
2022, just in case you're watching this in 23. But, I think you're right. This is a world to explore, and I think, we do get stuck in our ruts of what we like to taste and what our safety zones. But, I think with all of this out there, you could easily go up against some of the kind of more classic regions of the world with some of these whiskies and enjoy them in a similar way. If I was a rye fanatic from America, that Helsinki would equally make me happy. If I liked an Irish whiskey, maybe actually the Glenamore would, because that gentle, juicy, lovely fruit. And then, of course, milk and honey if you like something bigger and more powerful. Why the hell not? Dave?
Exactly.
I think that deserves a little slant.
Slant your honor.
Slant your honor.
Slant your honor, everyone.